For my senior year of college, I lived off campus for a number of different reasons. A, it was a lot cheaper than dorms. B, my apartment was just 2 blocks away from my part-time job. And C, Topper. What's a topper, I can probably hear you asking right now. But the question is not so much what Topper is, but who Topper is. Topper is purely a nickname, by the way, and if it wasn't for the fact that he was masquerading as a normal person somewhere with a cushy job and a young family, I'd call him by his real name. But I don't want to get him in trouble because, whether or not his wife knows it, Topper used to have a pretty wild past. Half the reason I ended moving in with Topper was his psychonautical shenanigans, a fancy term we used to refer to as insatiable hunger for narcotics. I was a poor senior with just enough cash to buy ramen and printer paper, whereas Topper had an actual job as a sound engineer. In a city like Seattle, you're never out of work if you can handle a mixer and detangle a web of cables. Topper could do both, and what's more, he was just a great guy. He was crazy as a crack house rat, but still, he was just about as warm and generous a person as you would ever likely meet. Me and Topper smoked a lot, and I was way too nervous about taking acid or shrooms in what was still a brand new apartment for me. It took me a few months, but when the time came, I told him I was ready for my first LSD experience. I figured that would involve me, him, maybe a third party in the form of a mutual friend of ours. But no, Topper decides to throw what he called a peyote party, where he and a bunch of his friends, me included, would all trip balls together. I was totally reluctant at first, as I heard you should be comfortable and familiar with your surroundings and your companions while doing hallucinogenic drugs. But on the night in question, Topper said we'd be spending a few hours talking, snacking, and generally getting comfortable with one another before we dose. That way, if I had any second thoughts when the time came, I could sit it out and just wait for another occasion. There was zero pressure like that with Topper. If you dosed, he loved you. If you didn't, he loved you. Just don't eat all those cheese doodles and it's all good, you know? Like I said, peyote party commences and our tiny apartment is filled with either strangers or people I hardly know at all. But over the course of about 2 or 3 hours, I make some friends, have some cool conversation, soak up the compliments that followed. Who made this guacamole? A good time was had by all. So when Topper taps a teaspoon against an empty wine glass and says in a silly French accent, "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is served," before unveiling a plate of acid-soaked blotting paper, I was like, screw it, I'm in. So I take my little piece of blotter paper. Topper had made me my own special piece with only a half dose for the newbie. Let it kind of dissolve into mush on my tongue, then I swallow it. And for like the first hour or so that followed, I didn't feel a thing. Then, like 90 minutes in, I think I ate too much hummus, I finally start to feel it. Or rather, feel it is not the right term. I started seeing these lines in my vision, little blurry lines that were hardly even detectable. But they are there, plain as day. Not long after, things started to go very, very wrong. Despite having once been super comfortable with all these new people, once I got this "who are these people and why are they here" thought in my head, things started falling apart, and I was headed into one heck of a bad trip. After a while of trying to keep calm, I ended up running down the hall to our bathroom and puking up this disgusting mess of hummus and pita bread. But at the time, puking just made things worse. Like I was convinced that I was about to puke up my stomach, my heart, my lungs. But the more I tried not to puke, the more I puked. And by the time I had "this was a bad idea" rattling around my head, it looked like there was no going back. Then, this is what happened following me locking myself in the bathroom. I hear a knock on the door and someone saying like, "You gotta come out, bud. Can't stay in there forever." I know they're right, so I unlock the door, and I'm greeted by this woman in her 50s who starts asking me if I'm okay. I didn't remember talking to her when I was sober, but the apartment was full of people coming and going, so I didn't think anything more of it. She asked me "Bad trip?" To which I just nod. So she offers me her hand and she leads me into my bedroom. I remember going to turn the light on, but she stopped me. I guess that would have been too much stimulation, and just rolls me in the bed before tucking me in. She fetches me a glass of water, tells me to drink as much as I can, and says something like, "You have to be strong. This isn't going to last forever. But you have to be strong, and you have that strength in you. So make me proud." She put on super soothing music on my iPod dock, then just left me there to ride out the bad trip. I remember not feeling as bad for a while after. And then there's a big gap in my memory because the next thing I remember, I was waking up and it was morning. I felt weird, really weird, like spaced out and ravenously hungry. So I walked into our little kitchenette and stuffing Captain Crunch into my face like it's the last box on Earth. Most of the partygoers had gone. There was just 2 remainders lying comatose on our couch, so I keep extra quiet until Topper stumbles into the room like, "Crazy night, huh? Sorry about your bad trip." I respond, "That's okay. That friend of yours, the older lady, she helped me feel tons better." He says, "Who?" So I start describing her, trying to remember what she was wearing. It's all coming back in patchy, fuzzy frames, so I'm just describing as I go. Again, he's like, "Dude, I have no idea who you're talking about. There was no one at that party over the age of 28, so unless someone wandered into the apartment and just so happened to guess you were tripping in the bathroom." And that's when it hit me. There was no older lady. I had hallucinated the entire thing. I was so messed up that I invented a person to help me out, to tell me what I needed to hear. And as cool as that was, realizing it was one of the freakiest moments in my life. It seemed so real, too real. Like I saw those weird lines too, but I didn't get into my head that someone had redecorated the apartment. So what was it about the woman that seemed so real? It took me a while, but I worked it out. I totally made this woman up, but she was talking with my mom's voice. That line about being strong, making her proud. She said those exact things to me when I broke my ankle on a skiing trip in 9th grade. I know this isn't the most traditional scary story. No ghosts or zombies or psycho killers with hooks for hands, but never in my life have I ever so vividly believed in something that just didn't exist. And it's actually kind of scary how powerful our brains are. Take a dose of one special chemical and boom, moving sound and picture show, right there in your head, using random pieces of information you thought you'd long since forgotten about. I haven't done anything like that since. The whole negative experience just put me off for life. I think that's the closest I'll ever get to seeing a ghost, if that makes sense. I legitimately saw something that seemed so real, but it was totally fake. And that's just about enough for one lifetime, if you ask me. I met my first serious boyfriend in my final year of college, and the first few months of our relationship were some of the happiest times of my life. Little did I know that our breakup the following year would result in him basically stalking me for 4 years afterwards. He made my life absolute torture for almost 5 times as long as we were actually a couple. And over time, someone I loved most in the world became someone I hated and feared with all my heart. A few months into our relationship, he started to display some increasingly possessive and controlling behavior. It was subtle at first. He'd asked if I'd done my workouts, then gently chide me if I'd been too busy to do them. He'd insist on knowing exactly what I was doing on any given day, and he repeatedly made comments on whatever I was eating, exclusively positive reinforcement, but that somehow made the whole thing even creepier. The fact that he was treating me more like a child or a pet than a girlfriend. I didn't just want to jump ship. I was really into him, and practically every young adult novel I'd read involving romance recommended honesty and communication. So, that's what I tried to do. Just warn him off that kind of controlling or patronizing behavior because it was super off-putting. At first, he seemed like he was completely incapable of taking any criticism regarding his behavior, which was yet another red flag. Yet when I assured him I'd be packing my bags if he didn't start treating me like an adult, he relented and promised to be better, but not without what was essentially a miniature temper tantrum. I just put it down to the shock of me threatening to leave. Like, it had upset me just to think about too, but still, if I'd have been as wise and world-weary as I am now, I'd have left him as soon as he began to beg. For about a month after, he was true to his word. He stopped being so possessive and let me live my life unhindered. Yet slowly but surely he started acting in the same old way, and that's when it became clear that it wasn't so much that he couldn't change, he just didn't want to. I knew the only way to proceed was to just be brave and break up with him so I could move on with my life. The breakup in itself was pathetic in the extreme. He cried and screamed and begged to the point where I wondered where the man I fell in love with had disappeared to. It took a while, but in the end he accepted. A full week went by without us talking, and I honestly thought that was the end of it. But as it turned out, it was only the beginning. At first, when we got back in contact, his behavior and demeanor seemed like nothing more than the regular pining of a spurned lover. He'd tell me he missed me, get angry when I didn't reply and send a wall of abusive text, then follow up by sending gifts to my job, like embarrassing me in front of my coworkers was somehow going to suddenly win me over. I thought this might last for a week or two at most. If I just maintained my policy of no contact, then he'd eventually lose interest and move on. But he didn't. Every time his texts and calls died down long enough for me to start hoping, they'd start right back up again as frenetic as ever. It was a real pain to change my phone number, but in the end, I had no choice. For a while that brought a measure of peace, but instead of giving up, my ex just upped his game. It started when I just so happened to bump into him at the Publix near my apartment. I put the first encounter down to chance, but he didn't make a scene or anything. We just exchanged looks and moved on. But then I started bumping into him on the way home from work too, and whenever I took my dog for a walk, and whenever I went for a run. And I realized it was never just us bumping into one another. He was actually stalking me. Confronting him about it did nothing, and the restraining order I filed was rejected until I returned with photo evidence of us bumping into one another at a multitude of different locations. But even when I got it approved by a judge, he kept the minimum distance of 100 feet, just watching me from afar. He basically was saying to me, I could do anything I want. I'm right here, and you're right there. And when that message finally came through, I knew I had to just pack my life up and move across the city. I even managed to get a transfer to a different branch of the company I worked for. But still, he somehow managed to track me down. I repeated the entire process a couple of months later, only this time, I moved entire cities. Granted, the other city was only like 50 miles away, so I could easily visit friends and family on weekends, but it was still a big move. Honestly, though, I was willing to do whatever it took at that point to be rid of my ex, and that meant purging my online presence too. Yet somehow, he kept getting a hold of my number and my address. Like, it got to the point where I became intensely paranoid, getting it into my head that a close friend or family member was passing on my information, maybe for money, maybe out of fear for their safety. I actually threatened to sue the company that prints out state phone books, and they insisted that they delisted me, but still I kept getting calls from my ex. Towards the end of the 4th year, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't concentrate at work. I was a shadow of my former self. And it all crept up so slowly that I didn't realize how bad things had gotten until I fainted at work. I was offered long-term sick leave, but since the sick pay wouldn't be nearly enough to actually cover my expenses, I had no choice but to carry on with my life, even though I feared it might end at any moment as a result of my own poor health. Just then, 2 months shy of his stalking having lasted a full 5 years, a friend of mine forwarded me a news story involving misuse of resources at the National Tax Office. Staff members were using insider knowledge to find themselves and their immediate families, enough tax loopholes to pay a trifling amount each year, which was obviously highly illegal. But one of the names listed in the story was one I was very, very familiar with. It was my ex, and although there was every chance he was committing the same tax fraud as the others, I knew he was abusing his position for another reason entirely. That's how, no matter how hard I tried to move on with my life, he was always able to get a hold of my updated contact details by looking up my freaking tax returns and other such paperwork. He and his coworkers were looking at lengthy prison sentences for what they'd done, and it seemed like finally I'd get the peace I'd been craving for so long. It might only be for a number of years until he could get out and find me again, but at least it would provide some measure of relief. Little did I know that this peace would turn out to be permanent, as my ex obviously couldn't face the time. He took his own life before his sentencing hearing. I'm not ashamed to say that I wept with utter relief once I heard the news. I know that sounds cruel, but you have to put yourself in my shoes. That man made my life the worst it's ever been for the longest time it's ever been that way. He made any kind of romantic relationship impossible, and those were the best dating years of my life, just burned away because he couldn't handle seeing me with anyone else. He wasn't sad at the losses he'd caused me, so I won't be sad about the losses he'd caused himself. It was throughout his own pathological stubborn and possessiveness that he came to find himself in such a situation. And if you ask me, he got everything he deserved. Everything. I was a fresh-faced graduate from high school. The summer before I left for UT, I took a construction job. I had a full scholarship for my first 2 years, but having a full wallet would help pay for the small things. Most of the other guys were friendly and entertaining. A day didn't pass where we weren't doubled over in laughter because of something someone did or said. 2 of the guys were exceptionally funny. Mark and Daniel had been working on separate sites or together for the past 15 years. They were both grade A practical jokers, but sometimes Mark would take things a little too far. Daniel was more than often the target of his humor. This would become a source of tension between the two, but they always made up by the end of the workday. As you may expect, eventually Mark's joking would go too far for Daniel to overlook. That day just happened to be on my final week on the job. For some time, everyone on the site had noticed Daniel wasn't himself. He spent long periods of time somewhere talking on his phone. When he wasn't gone, he seemed constantly agitated. His usual happy-go-lucky manner had disappeared. We'd all tried our best to make him laugh, but nothing had worked. Not even Mark could do it. As time went on, we all began to believe his troubles were about his girlfriend. When Mark heard about this, he couldn't stop himself from poking at the sore spot. On this day, Daniel had gone on the phone, and when he came back, Mark started joking around. "What's wrong, Danny boy? Are you having troubles at home? Is your old lady getting the bone from the mailman?" The verbal jabs only served to annoy Daniel even further. He said nothing. Instead, he just stared at Mark like he was going to burn through him with his eyes. Mark wasn't going to let his bad mood get in the way of getting a laugh. After lunch and throughout the rest of the day, Mark continued on with his jokes. Daniel, a guy who usually said something when he was fed up, held his tongue the whole day. I knew if he didn't put a stop to Mark's poking, he would take things too far and cause a problem, maybe even a fight, I thought. Daniel was clearly not in any mood to let the remarks roll off his back. And as quitting time arrived, I relaxed. I was almost sure Mark would let up. Unfortunately, things only got worse. A lot worse. It was quitting time. We were going around the site picking up our tools and cleaning any trash we'd left behind. Everyone was focused on the task at hand. I was off in my own little world, thinking about any last-minute things I needed to do before I left for school. When everything was complete, we were all standing around discussing our plans for the forthcoming weekend. It had been a while since Mark had made any jokes, and I assumed he'd stop for the day. When his turn came, he looked very serious and said, "Well, I think since old Danny's going fishing, I'll go over to his place and give his old lady some boning." The joke had come by complete surprise to all of us. and we all fell over ourselves laughing. All but Daniel, of course. I saw a snarl appear across his face. His teeth were gritted so tightly it looked like they'd crumble any second.
I'm so sick of your stupid jokes.
No sooner had he said this, Daniel stepped forward with his hammer drawn back. I was precariously close to Mark at the time. I stumbled back so quickly I fell onto my butt. I looked up just as Daniel brought the claw end of the hammer into Mark's skull. Mark immediately fell over seizing. Writhing around on the floor, I was in shock, and I froze where I was. I watched Daniel for his next move. He stood over Mark's convulsing body for a moment, surveying his handiwork, I suppose. I was relieved when he calmly walked over to a bench and just sat down. I don't think I could have moved had he come at me. Just like me, the other guys were frozen in place watching as Mark's body slowly came to a limp halt. And we all looked at each other, too terrified to speak. Daniel broke the silence for us. I guess y'all should call the cops. I'm not gonna run off or anything, I'm just a little fed up. The resignation in his voice showed just how far gone he was. The old Daniel I knew wouldn't have done anything like this. We did like he asked, and he didn't give the cops any trouble when it came time to take him away. I thought the shock was affecting me at that moment, but even now, I don't feel anything but sorry for Daniel. It would come out later just how bad things had been going on at home. His girlfriend at the time had cheated on him more than once. She had blamed it all on him, and he had been working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep her happy and keep up with expenses. He was neck deep in love and too blind to realize what was happening until it already had happened. After all he did to give her what she wanted, she had the nerve to complain about him being gone so much. When he was at work, all he could think about was, is she with another guy right now? He was too private to share any of this with us. I don't think Mark had any idea what was truly occurring. He took a shot, and when he saw that he'd hit a nerve, he rode it into the ground. And he did that a lot, and I suppose this turned out to be one too many. I'm sometimes still in shock when I sit back and think about how quickly his life left his body, even in those last few convulsing moments. All of us offered to serve as character witnesses, but it turned out not to be necessary. A deal was struck and Daniel agreed to serve 15 years. He's been offered parole in the intervening years, but declined it. With his release date soon approaching, I hope he's able to get his life back together and move beyond the shadow of this crime of passion, I suppose you could say. I've saved the most important person in the story for last. Mark's story obviously ended on that job site. Some readers may wonder why Daniel had received so much sympathy and Mark so little. Well, the truth is, although he was a really funny guy, that was about all he had going for him. I said already how far he would push Daniel with his joking. Heck, some folks may call it bullying these days, and I'd say they'd be right. He didn't do that to just Daniel. Not one of us evaded his comedic jabs, and that was far from his worst trait, though. Even around a bunch of East Texas rednecks, Mark's racism was off-putting. Like with his jokes, not a single culture was off limits, and he wasn't afraid to say it. I won't even get into his views on women. I'll just sum it up by saying Mark was not a good person. Funny people tend to get away with things us other folks can't. However, even when you're making people laugh, there's a line, and unfortunately for Mark, he crossed it. One time too many.